True Stories of Human Trafficking features Sabrina's own videos from Ground Zero in Anchorage, Alaska. Some names have been changed to protect the innocent, and some names have been left in to shine light on the guilty.
Welcome to True Stories of Human Trafficking. You can find more videos on Rumble by searching Sweet Justice or Fight Evil. We fight modern slavery and pursue freedom and justice for all. You're in the right place if you want to learn from real-life experiences. Please click the subscribe button and like or comment if you're inclined. Warning, this true story contains some material that may come across as graphic, but please stay to the end of this one to watch the most passionate display of a blessing I have ever seen or felt. Today's true story is my own. I have not been trafficked. We all bump up against human trafficking, and I bumped pretty hard. This is my firsthand story of Rosanna and how she got trafficked, and the story of Reba, who did not survive being trafficked. I met Rosanna and Reba at the Anchorage Women's Emergency Shelter. I arrived in Anchorage in September of 21 and met Mayor Dave Bronson, who introduced me to the Women's Emergency Shelter, also known as the Downtown Hope Center, or DHC. It's a nonprofit that doesn't accept government funding and produces miraculous outcomes for the people they serve. In addition to serving a few hundred servings of soup and sandwiches every day and providing showers and laundry services to the homeless, they also provide those same services and dinner every night, 365 days of the year, to about 70 women who come into that shelter needing everything, starting with the basics. They need a warm place to sleep, some food, and they need people who care, and they get all of that at Downtown Hope Center. The executive director of the place is Sherry Laurie, a powerhouse rock star who gets things done, and along with her incredible team of staff and volunteers, produce amazing outcomes. When I met Sherry, I told her I needed a place to live, and the perfect solution for both of us was to make me the property manager for Sweet Hope, transitional housing for the women who come to the shelter and then enroll in the culinary or bakery programs. It's an 18-room apartment building, and it became my home and my responsibility, and it was a daily challenge to keep those women safe. Downtown Anchorage has a very high crime rate. How high? Alaska is considered the deadliest state for women. A staggering 59% of women in Alaska have experienced severe violence. The state also ranks highest in rape, murder, and assaults. Nearly 45% of trafficked youth identified were Alaska native. Alaska's rate of sexual assault is nearly 4 times the national average. Alaska has 161 sexual assaults per 100,000 residents, compared to 42 nationally. Alaska has the highest rate of sexual abuse of minors and child abuse. Child sexual assault is nearly 6 times the national average. Building relationships with the women of the shelter exposed me and every staff member at DHC to the realities of human trafficking. Nearly every woman I met had a story of a predator victimizing them during their days on the streets. The story of 2 of those girls, Rosanna and Reba, will stay with me forever. Rosanna and Reba were our youngest guests at the shelter, about 21 years old. Rosanna had a sister in Anchorage who didn't hold up a very good example for her, and Reba's mother was actually a previous guest at the shelter. They were no strangers to the streets. They were both really sweet girls. They were also hard to convince that the men pulling up in nice trucks outside of the shelter to party were not to be trusted. There was so much drug dealing going on. In fact, the biggest drug dealers were so low in the pecking order that they didn't even drive nice trucks. They drove hoopties and bicycles and catered to the homeless people who camped on the corner, and they stalked trafficking victims. In fact, this is real footage of one of the drug dealers we dealt with in the neighborhood. The dealer would pull up, and the runners, or more accurately, people on stolen bicycles, would pull up and get the drugs for distribution, and off they'd go. I've said before that drugs and trafficking go hand in glove, and that certainly played out in Anchorage. We constantly had drug users on the property that had to be strongly encouraged to move along, sometimes with my trusty bullhorn. This guy sold drugs at the bus stop and one day decided to have sex on my front porch. Our cameras caught everything, so his impotent performance is famous now. The standard operating procedure for these guys is to use drugs to get people addicted, so selling them as prostitutes is easier. One of the guys who pulled up on the homeless camp got out and slapped one of the girls. This is real footage. She responded by yelling out his name, and that proved to come in handy later on. His name is David. And one day we had several prayer warriors out in the street. They were just praying over the homeless camp and praying over Sweet Hope. And the next thing we know, David comes barreling down the street and nearly takes us out. He runs his car up on the curb and just sat there glaring at us. So the ladies are freaking out, and David and I had words. I went up to his window, called him by his given name. And when I did that, man, his head snapped around like it was on a high tension spring. He got out of his car and we went toe to toe. I told him who he was at that moment in time versus the man God created him to be. And I prayed his true identity all over him until he literally fell on his butt and he sat there with his head hanging while I told him that he was a priceless child of God. So act like it. And finally he goes, I'm not comfortable with this. And I'm like, I bet you're not. You're not supposed to be pushing drugs. You're not going to be comfortable with that. He gets back in his car and peeled out. We never saw David again. The optimist in me wants to believe that he cleaned up his act and went on to pursue his true identity in Christ, but he may have just moved to a different hood. Either way, the power of prayer is fierce. One day, the state troopers pulled up at the shelter and delivered Rosanna back to us. She had been missing for 3 days. She made the wrong decision to get in the truck with two guys who just wanted to party. She felt safe because she knew these guys, not well, but she had seen them before hanging out with her sister. Most victims know their trafficker. She wasn't a drug user, so she felt like going out for just one beer would be okay. She had that one beer and woke up 3 days later in a town 3 hours away from Anchorage. She said she would wake up and someone would be raping her. And she remembered them videoing her and taking pictures with their phone, and then she would pass out again. Thankfully, she was able to flee from her captors, take a picture of their vehicle, and get to safety, but not before she was brutally assaulted, and video and photographs were taken of her, and not before severe trauma was inflicted upon her body and psyche. I took her to the hospital for her rape exam, and the damage was extensive. Reba got in the truck with some guys too. Reba didn't make it back home. She was found dead in a snowbank, a few blocks up the road with strangle marks on her neck. Her poor mother, who had battled her way off of the street and into sobriety, was just crushed. This is what human trafficking looked like in Alaska, constantly chasing off the bad guys, placing restraining orders on people, calling the cops when the restraining orders were broken, and calling in the FBI when a woman had a new story of trafficking to investigate. Some of those stories included Satan worship and human sacrifice. The FBI team never blinked an eye when they heard that someone's baby had been sacrificed. They had heard it before. Up until a few years ago, that is not what I thought human trafficking looked like. Just the words themselves painted a picture in my mind that it had to do with people far, far away and with putting people in a cargo container and taking them to a third world country. Then Hollywood gave me another great picture. It was framed in the drama of Taken, a Liam Neeson movie.
I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. If you are looking for ransom, I can tell you I don't have money. But what I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills I've acquired over a very long career. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
And that's the picture I carried around until I went to a fundraiser in Colorado, and a woman who had actually been trafficked took the stage and told her story. She wasn't kidnapped. She knew her trafficker. He wasn't a stranger. He had spent months grooming her to trust him. Grooming is a process that predators use to make a child an easier victim for future sexual abuse. Usually, grooming starts with building a positive relationship with the child, their family, and sometimes the community. The predator does this so that their victim lets their guard down. When I heard her story about how many times a day she was violated, something snapped in me. I started paying attention to modern slavery headlines and researching the stories of survivors. The New York Times reports that last year, there were 45 million online photos and videos of children being sexually abused. So fast forward to 2021, and I meet a lady who works with a non-government agency called Love Justice International. As well as working on fundraising for Love Justice, this woman and her husband have a beautiful ministry displaying art that people have created to depict survivors of human trafficking, to raise awareness. When I heard what the organization was all about, I got excited. They actually interfere in the trafficking process and get potential victims to safety. They have perfected a protocol called transit monitoring. After training, a monitor patrols transit areas, bus stops, airports, train stations, and by spotting red flags, the protocol is proven to work. And as a result, Love Justice has intercepted 36,955 people who were on their way to being trafficked. This boots on the ground concept got my attention, and within the month, I had quit my job as a global business development manager for a software company, and I became the first domestic Love Justice International project manager. There are many cities that we know have high rates of human trafficking: Tampa, Florida, New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Chicago. But they identified a town that had the highest victim rate per capita, and that's how I got to Anchorage, Alaska. I was raised in Texas, but I've spent years in Colorado, and I can tell you that Alaska is what would happen if Colorado and Texas got together and had a big fat baby. All the swagger and independence of Texas and all the beauty of Colorado, but bigger, much, much bigger and darker. The root of the problem in Alaska has several contributing factors, and if we take a look at these facts, we can learn a lot about trafficking in general. Traffickers target the vulnerable, and Alaska has a lot of vulnerable people. Alaska has a lot of indigenous peoples, and Native people often live in areas that are hard to reach. Some of their communities have a history of sexual assault and abuse. Kids who grow up in a home where they experience abuse are prime targets for a trafficker to come along and take advantage of those vulnerabilities. As a result, the Women's Emergency Shelter in downtown Anchorage is full of women who have suffered at the hands of a predator in their home before coming to Anchorage and then suffering at the hands of a trafficker. Alaska's problem is as big as its geographical mass, and that's actually a literal part of the challenge. Troopers and law enforcement are challenged to cover the villages of Alaska. Alaskans who need services typically end up in Anchorage, so the homeless population is vast and resources are stretched. Native women suffer higher rates of violence in the United States than any other group, including Black males. Human trafficking in Alaska is what happens between missing and murdered. Have you ever wondered what happens after a victim is picked up by a trafficker? Where is a victim taken? Trap houses. Sometimes the trafficker just holds them in their vehicle. Other times it's a hotel, and frequently they're taken to a trap house. You've probably seen trap houses in movies. There are properties where drugs are dealt, done, and used to control sex trafficking victims. The upstairs usually hosts the drug deals and drug users, while the lower level serves as a movie set to broadcast victims being abused on the internet. A lot of times anything goes. We had a woman in the shelter who had endured such trauma in a trap house that her personality split into several. When she tried to talk about trauma from her past, she would slip into a completely different personality and talk to us like a little girl. Other times, she would just growl and her eyes would go black. It was as if her development arrested at the age she was when the trauma first began, and this was her way of coping with her reality. In Alaska, human trafficking is fought by state troopers. Commissioner James Cockrell of the Alaska Department of Safety offered me a position as a criminal justice technician in the sex offender registry. It was an intense 4 months of reviewing the criminal backgrounds of sex offenders, working with law enforcement and criminal justice agencies in Alaska and nationwide. It was enlightening to read so many case files and understand similarities among predators and how they operate. That's why I keep posting these true stories of human trafficking. If we normalize an open dialogue about the problem of sex trafficking and understand how these criminals do business, we have a better chance of identifying when it's happening right in front of us, and we can potentially save a life. You can be a trafficking abolitionist. There's 2 ways. One, if you're an Alaskan, and then another if you're everybody else. Alaskans, please see the description for tangible ways that you can make a difference today, because your state is trying to pass legislation on legalizing prostitution. And we know for a fact, based on every other state and country who has done this, that sex trafficking increases with legalized prostitution. You can stop it and save a life. If you don't live in Alaska, leave a comment and share these videos with someone to raise awareness, open the dialogue, and to get people talking. It's a heavy subject, but together we can carry the weight and make a difference. Regardless of political affiliation, together we can fight the biggest atrocity of our generation. I'll leave you with this. I've mentioned a few times that there is power in prayer. In honor of Alaskan Natives, I want to share the most beautiful, most powerful prayer I've ever seen. This is my Native Athabascan friend, Eric, in his full glory. It's beautiful. Until next time.